In this lecture, we're going to be looking at the transition of society from a modern society or modernity to late modernity and possibly postmodernism. Now, I say possibly postmodernism because it's still up for debate as to whether or not we are in a late modern or postmodern society. But we will look at the characteristics of each of these stages of social development, and we'll evaluate to a certain degree whether or not we are in each of these stages. Now, with modernity, there is no debate. It is accepted that we are in a, or have been in a state of modernity. It's as we've moved forward through that modernity as to whether or not we have moved into post-modernity or we are in a late modern society. So before we can look at that debate regarding whether or not we are in late modern or postmodern, we need to understand what we mean by modernity. So modernity developed in the late 18th century as a result of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a period of time that was the movement away from religious and supernatural explanations for phenomena to a more scientific and rational understanding of phenomena, and it was categorized by by four main things. The first being the development of the nation state. Now, I've used the example of Italy here because up until about the late 1800s or mid to late 1800s, Italy was a group of city-states. Milan had its own thing going on, Rome had its own thing going on, Florence, and this is the time of like the Medicis and all of that. But towards the end of the 18th century and early 19th century, we start seeing the development of nation states and this concept of a nation state as a key political unit, which was defined as a geographical area ruled by a central government. The other element of modernity is capitalism, the growth of private ownership of the means of production and the use of wage labourers. Now, we've already talked about what capitalism is in the lecture on Marxism, but we've seen this is the era of industrial revolution, of changes in religious belief, which allowed for the development of the capitalist system. And as I've already mentioned, it is an era of rationality, moving away from religious explanations and supernatural explanations for phenomena that was unexplainable, and looking for more scientific and technological explanations for phenomena. So the discussion regarding what was the center of the solar system, the Earth or the Sun? Things like the seasons and disease, and moving away from this idea of it's God's will to a more kind of this is caused by bacteria or this is caused by this, that, or the other. And the final part of a modern state is individualism. And what we're meaning here is that and this links very closely to the development of capitalism, where people started thinking about themselves first and their communities second. We see the development of the privatized nuclear family, which is more geographically mobile to go where work is. So it is more about what is best for me in the first instance, and then maybe how can this support my community as a secondary kind of thought process. Now, as I've said, there is evidence that we have been in modernity, and it is generally accepted sociologically, economically, politically, that we have been in a state of modernity since the late 18th century. So what can we say is this evidence? What is it that tells us we have been in this state of modernity since this period? So the first the first piece of evidence we've got is, as I said, the new nation states. Germany, France, Italy all started, or all kind of developed around this time, moving away from the idea of principalities. Germany moving away from the elements of the Holy Roman Empire, France kind of coming together. Obviously, they had the French Revolution in this period of time as well. So we did see new nation states. The other nation states we need to think about, the United States of America, which for a long time was known as the colonies up until the War of Independence and 1776 and the Declaration of Independence. So we can actually see historically that these nation states were appearing. We've also got the Industrial Revolution. Now this is clear evidence of the development of technology and science, moving away from agricultural economics to more technological and scientific means of production. And finally, you've got exploration and colonization. As I said, during this time, we were talking about the United States or America, which was up until 1776, colonies of various states, of various nations around the world: France, England, Spain, Germany, the Dutch. Everyone claimed their stake. And this was the same with areas of Africa, Australasia, Canada, South America, the Western European expansion. And this kind of led to a growth of multiculturalism. But the argument comes in now as to whether or not we're still in this modern state or whether we've developed further than that. And this is where we bring in the idea of late modernity, and the argument that we are not necessarily entering a new era, but we are just we're entering a developmental phase of modernity, which is characterized by the losing of power by social structures, so gender, ethnicity, etc., but they're not completely powerless. Now, Anthony Giddings, who is sometimes he's a late modernist, sometimes he's a postmodernist, depending on what he's talking about, argued that there are two key features of late modernity that we can clearly see in society today. The first being what he referred to as disembedding. And this is a reaction, or a reaction, I think that's probably the wrong word, but this is caused by technological growth. And it means that we no longer require face-to-face contact in order to interact with people. The geographical borders that were once in place have now broken down. And I think lockdown has really shown the extent of this disembedding, where everything, all communication, unless you were living with somebody, was done electronically. Even teaching, there was no face-to-face teaching, or majority of face-to-face teaching didn't occur during the lockdowns. Instead, it was done via electronic means: Teams, Google Classroom, Zoom, whatever it was that that particular school was using. But even in that time, even before then, we've got FaceTime, instant messaging, email, all of these things that create a impersonal interaction between people. Yes, it's instantaneous, but Giddings argued that it's more impersonal. And one of the things that I found interesting, and this is something that is very personal to me, but we've now even moved away from telephones. Telephone calls, there is a growing fear of telephone calls, and I absolutely hate them. They terrify me. I would rather do a video call than do a phone call. But that's just me. The other aspect of a late modern society, as put forward by Giddings, is the idea of reflexivity. Now, this is different to the reflexivity that Garfinkel was talking about in ethnomethodology. What Giddings is talking about in terms of reflexivity is that we are no longer in an era of certainty. Everything is being constantly reevaluated. Our ideas, our theories, our identities, our cultures, everything is becoming more contextual, more reflective, and we're not afraid to change or grow. And to a certain extent, and maybe not completely, but to a certain extent, we're not afraid to admit we were wrong about things and change our minds. Now, the other key thinker for late modernity is Ulrich Beck. And he, again, sometimes postmodernist, sometimes late modernist, depending on what he's talking about. And you'll see Beck come up a few more times throughout this course. But Beck talks about the growth of risk society. And what Beck means by this is that through that growth of technology and scientific advancement, we have created more risks to humanity, to our lives, through pollution, through nuclear weaponry, through obesity, environmental issues. So we are now living in a society where we face more risk from human activity than we do from natural risks, so natural disasters or nature doing its thing. Now, it can be argued as well that we have created even more natural risks through environmental issues, through climate change or manufactured climate change. But Beck could still consider these to be a manufactured risk because they have been caused or exacerbated by human behavior and human development. The other thing he talks about is individualism, and this takes it a step further than what we were talking about with the nation state, because what Beck's talking about here is that we're no longer governed by tradition in terms of how we act. Instead, we think for ourselves, we reflect on the possible consequences of our actions, and we change and adapt to our own belief systems. That's not to say that traditions have completely died out. A lot of people are still very traditional to their cultures, or continue with traditions of their families, their communities, etc. But we're a lot more discerning now as to why we do things and why we engage in certain actions and certain behaviours. There are lots of people who, like myself, no longer choose not to celebrate Christmas. Now, personally, it's not about the gifts, it's not about anything like that. The whole thing, no, I just don't like it. But there are people who consider the impact of traditions. Christmas cards. I haven't sent a Christmas card in years, and that's a choice I've made to be more environmentally friendly. It's a choice that I make that's, for me, I don't see it's a waste of paper, a waste of card and postage and all the rest of it. I also don't send birthday cards for the same reason. So this individualization is more about thinking for ourselves, what traditions, what customs do we want to continue with, and which ones do we kind of like, actually, you know what, that's not for me. And society as a whole is generally more accepting of these things. Not always. I still get people kind of going, what, you don't celebrate Christmas? Are you a Scrooge? And it's like, I don't begrudge anyone celebrating Christmas, I just don't want to do it myself. So there is that kind of, there are some things that are considered sacred and you're not allowed to say things like that, but there are also many more people who, or society that is much more accepting of the different choices that people are making regarding the way that they live their lives. And the final part of it is, and this kind of brings these two things together, is this idea of risk consciousness. And what Beck is arguing here is that we are becoming more and more aware of these risks, more and more aware of the risks that we are creating within our own societies, within our own countries, and we are trying to mitigate against those risks. You've obviously seen over the last few years the growing discussion of climate change and how we can be more environmentally friendly. We've seen people being much more aware of biological contamination, particularly during lockdown, but even before then, people were becoming more and more aware of having to wash their hands, personal hygiene, the effects of drugs and alcohol, and mitigating against those risks. So this all suggests, according to Beck and Giddings, that we have moved beyond modernity, but the social structures of society still hold power over us. There is still certain expectations according to your gender, your ethnicity, your age, your disability, your sexuality, that haven't quite lost their power to shape our choices and our opportunities within society. Now, there is evidence, obviously, that we are in this late modern state. Firstly, there is identity choice. When I was at school, it was still under the, what was known as Section 28 at the time, where you weren't even allowed to discuss LGBTQA plus issues in schools. Not at all. It was heteronormative all the way. No textbooks, fiction, anything like that related to LGBTQAI plus. Now we are much more open to identity choice and creating an identity that we as individuals feel comfortable with, and explaining our identity choices without feeling like asking is a bad thing. It's always better to ask than not. There's also the growth of technology and the internet. I mean, the internet is coming up for 30 years old. And I say that in terms of commercial internet. Internet in labs and things like that has been around for far longer, but commercial internet is only around 30 years old, and Wi-Fi even younger than that. Commercial Wi-Fi. So for many of you, the idea of life without the internet is kind of like, well, what did you do? We use books, but we are seeing this growth of, and even in the last year, the growth of AI in everyday situations. I use it all the time as part of my lesson planning and resource creation. I use it as an editing tool, graphics creation, but this was never really a thing 20-30 years ago. It wasn't even, it was sci-fi. And also the growth of social protests. protests are not a new thing. They haven't been a new thing for a very, very long time. People have been protesting for centuries. But what we're seeing now is the growth of social protests. So these are protests which are linked directly to social issues, racism, homophobia, gender issues, rather than political or economic ones. And now those political economic protests still occur and are a key element of the democratic process. But the social protests are evidence of moving more towards a late modern society because it's showing an awareness of these issues. However, Rustin argues that, as you can tell, he's from a Marxist viewpoint, that it's capitalism and not technology that's causing the most risk to modern society. It's capitalism that is pushing the technological advancement. And you can use Apple as an example here. Apple bring out a new phone every 2 to 3 years. And they've got to keep, if they want people to keep pushing, to keep buying their technology, they have to keep pushing what these phones can do. And Nokia at one point was at risk of going bust because their phones were indestructible. I mean, I still have my 3310 from when I was at university and it still works. Obviously, it's not a smartphone, but by having technology that's not advancing, that's not pushing the envelope, your company's not going to make money. So capitalism is the cause of the risk that we are now living in, rather than technology. Technology is just the method that the capitalism is taking. Hirst also argues that risk-conscious movements are too big and too fragmented to bring about real change. Now, as I've said, the social protests that we've seen in recent years, Black Lives Matters, the Sarah Everard protests, the environmental protests such as Just Stop Oil and Greta Thunberg, the Wall Street sit-ins and things like that. Yeah, they've got column inches in newspapers and they've got time on the air talking about them, but have they actually affected any real tangible change? And Hirst says that they don't because they are not cohesive enough. It's lots of little things going on rather than one big movement. And also, we still need to take into account that these social structures still do hold a lot of power. There is still expectations regarding what you do and who you are and how you look according to your gender, according to your age, according to your sexuality. Those stereotypes still hold power. Now, so whether I think we can say that, yeah, there is evidence that we're in a late modern society, but Baudrillard and Lyotard take it a step further and suggest that we're actually now moved into a new era of society, the postmodern era of society. And Baudrillard and Lyotard are just two of many postmodernist sociologists who have spoken about this. Now, one of the characteristics of a postmodern society is fragmentation. And what is meant by this is that we don't have homogenous culture anymore, that everyone is creating their own culture, their own ways that they want to live their life. There are fewer people continuing the traditions of their families, traditions of their cultures. It's not to say that these cultures are dying out, it's just it's not as important as it once was. And this fragmentation becomes instability. There's constant change, constant movement. So society is no longer as stable. And another element of this fragmentation links to choice. And the idea that we now are have so much more choice, and our identities are our choices. We can choose as individuals how we want to live our lives, how we want to dress, how we want to proceed through our careers or our family structures, our belief systems. It is not unusual now to find children having different beliefs and political, cultural beliefs to their parents. And identity now, according to Baudrillard and Lyotard and the other postmodernists, our identities are no longer shaped by culture, by ethnicity, by religion, by gender, or that sort of thing. That we are creating consumer identities. You're a Nike person or you're an Adidas person. You're a Pepsi or a Coke. You're Pizza Hut or Domino's. I know that's a lot of food there. But people do kind of identify by what they buy. Are you Android or are you iOS? I'm an Android person. But we do identify by that, and we use it to kind of, and I do it myself when people talk about tech. I'm just like, oh, I'm an Android person. Does it work on Android? And I would never go to iOS. Just personal preference, each to their own. But iOS isn't. I won't use MacBooks or anything like that because that's not what I choose. And the other element that comes from Baudrillard mainly is about this idea of hyperreality or simulacra. And this is where Baudrillard is saying that it's getting harder and harder to differentiate fact and fiction, or reality and fiction. And he says that society is no longer based on the production of goods, but on the buying and selling of knowledge, which bears no resemblance or no relation to the reality, because the truth, we're living in a collapsing meta-narrative. There is no longer seen as being the truth. Instead, it is a perception of truth. Your truth, my truth, their truth, and somewhere in the middle is the facts. And what he says is simulacra is when start this again. He calls the signs that stand for nothing as simulacra. So by not having something to, people don't have something to stand for anymore. Now the hyperreality is linked into the blurring of reality and image, and this can go back to what we were talking about with Goffman and the dramaturgical model, where the outward projection of who we are becomes more important than the reality of who we are, the authentic us, if you like. It's like you get those TikTokers and Instagram posts that kind of go, oh, I woke up like this morning, and you're like, no, you didn't. You spent an hour and a half doing your hair and makeup, you tidied your room, and then you took this post. Absolutely no way you woke up like this, unless of course your hair's sticking out all over the place and you look like you need a ton of coffee. You've got scripted reality TV shows such as Towie and the Kardashians and the Family Stallone, I think, is a new one that's come out, which all blur that line between their authentic real lives and this reality TV, the entertainment of their lives. And actually, they do say at the beginning of these reality TV shows, this is some situations have been created for your entertainment. So why is it that people argue that we are living in a postmodern society? So what evidence have we got? The first one is, again, these lifestyle choices, but it goes further than what the late modernists were saying, in the fact that they are now the postmodernists suggest that we have complete control over our lifestyles. We have what they refer to as negotiated relationships, and when those relationships don't meet our needs, we move on to the next one. So we might have a loving wonderful, intimate relationship going on, but that when that relationship stops meeting our needs, then we will end that relationship and move on to one that does. And we've already talked about scripted reality TV and this idea of TOWIE and things like that that are projecting a lifestyle and a reality that isn't real. But there are people that believe they're real. They believe that these things occur. And a classic example is one of the later series of the Kardashians. I don't know which one it was, where there was photographs in gossip magazines about how they were filming their Christmas special in October. So clearly this reality TV is not reality. They're creating scenarios for TV purposes. And as I've said about the consumer identity, and I've used the example here of the Vesco girl, like I have no idea how that's pronounced, that have certain items that are part of who they are. Now, some of these identities have been around for a very long time. So the goths, the punks, the mods and the rockers, but the number of these consumer identities has exponentially exploded over time. And you see it in TV and in movies and things like that. You have the high school cliques of who's in what group and who's doing what, where, when, why, and how. But this consumer identity has become a huge part of a person's way of identifying their tribe, if you like, identifying who they are, who their group is. However, as I said, there is debate about whether or not we are actually in postmodernity at the moment or whether we're still in late modernity. Philo and Miller says that the postmodernist society is ignoring power inequalities that still exist in society. It overlooks the barriers that people have to their opportunities and choices. For example, poverty. You may want to be, an astrophysicist. I don't know where that's come from, but your financial situation, your socioeconomic background means that that's perhaps not necessarily something you can do because you can't afford the opportunities to do those things. They go on to argue that it also ignores the limitations placed by social structures that still exist. There is still this expectation of what it means to be a girl and what it means to be a boy or a woman or a man. There's still, although it's getting better, there is still this expectation on women to be fulfilled by having children. It is getting better. I will say that it is getting better than it was, but there is still that kind of, oh, you'll want them one day, oh, you never know, arguments. There's still the idea that disabled people are limited in what they can do. Now, obviously, with some physical disabilities, there are some limits, but there is limitations that perhaps limit the opportunities that some people have due to hidden disabilities as well as more obvious disabilities. And Best and Kellner suggests that postmodernity is more of a descriptive theory than an explanation of society, because it doesn't tell us how or why these things happen. They just kind of say, this is what a postmodern society looks like. But how are we going to get there? Why are we heading towards this? Why are we focusing more on our consumer identity and choices within society? So whether or not we're in a postmodern society or not, that's up to you to decide. But we can guarantee, or that it is accepted, I should say, rather than guarantee, it is accepted that we are living or have been living in a modern society, in modernity. There is evidence to suggest that we've moved into late modernity, and there is evidence to suggest that maybe we've gone even further than that into post-modernity.